However, and the temptation was for me to believe that that was a sensitizing event and to release all the emotions, and we did do some emotional release on that.
Right.
But it wasn't a key event in connection with food. And again, folks, when we work with somebody, we work based upon their goals. What that means is, even though there was a lot of trauma and upset surrounding that event, I was there to help this lady lose weight. That was her goal, right? And so we had to focus on that aspect of the goal. Not that there wasn't other useful healing work to be done as far as the other trauma was concerned, but that wasn't the goal.
Right.
Was there.
It wasn't driving it. The
Right.
behaviors that were with the weight gain.
Correct.
So you wanted to get back to what the real event
Right.
for the weight gain is.
Correct. So having stimulated this feeling at the time of when she moved, we ask a question in that hypnotic state, which is, and again, in the hypnotic state, it's very important that we do not lead people. We do not tell them where they should go or what they
Right.
should do or what they should feel or implant ideas. But we can ask questions. And a question I asked in this moment, this feeling that you are having now, in this moment that your subconscious mind has brought you to, is it new or old? And she said straight away it's old. And what that indicates to us, folks, is that there is an earlier event that is significant.
Right. She's felt that feeling before.
Right.
So now at this time it feels old.
Right.
Right. So you know there is something earlier that you need to get to and you need to help her go to.
Right. And folks, we don't know what it is.
Right. Yeah, we don't know.
We've got no idea.
Right, exactly.
I mean, this is the thing I have to emphasize to all watching this, is that we do not sit there and say, yes, we know why you are doing this or not doing it. We really don't. But your subconscious mind does. And we trust the fact that properly stimulated, without us leading, the subconscious mind will bring you to that. And that's when the healing process, as we call it, in this case in relation to weight, changes.
Right.
So we stimulate it, and then she gets back to a much, not that much earlier, but it's about 2 years earlier.
Right.
So she was somewhere around 7. And again, folks, it's not always the case that people say, oh yeah, I'm exactly 7 at this, unless they've got a marker by it. But around about 7, we think.
Right.
But they're very clear on the incident, and this incident was quite different. In this incident, she was with, at the time, one of her friends, and she was in the basement of the friend's house.
Mm-hmm.
And the friend had previously had her 7-year birthday party, and left behind in the basement was, you know, the remnants of the birthday cake.
Right.
And my client, at 7 years old, saw this cake, and a few things immediately arose in her. She told me, in the hypnotic state, that she'd never had a bought cake.
She had homemade cakes,
Right.
But to her, someone who buys a cake for you, it's higher value.
Right. Even though afterwards, out of hypnosis, she admitted quite cheerfully, and I believed her, that her mother's homemade cakes were probably better than all the bought cakes.
Right.
But the feeling that she had as a young person was that somebody loves me enough to go out and buy something special.
Right.
Right. In this instance, and this was this object. So immediately, she feels a sense of longing and sadness. Right.
Just seeing the cake.
Just seeing the cake.
Yep.
And she said in hypnosis, and it was very sad, and she sounded like saying, why can't somebody do that for me? Why don't I deserve that? And you could hear that sadness. Now we get into a key emotion.
You can hear that little girl.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? She's not just remembering this, she's reliving it. But she's not reliving it exactly as the little girl, because she's no longer a little girl. She's a little girl and the woman that she's become, and I'm there too. And that's why, folks, as we've mentioned before, she's not being re-traumatized in this event.
That's what I was going to say. Yep.
Right.
Good.
So, we move through this, and what happens next is she goes, at this point, and she takes a piece of this cake, which is a little bit stale at this point, and she starts to eat it. And immediately that happens, her friend begins to mock her. Oh, look at you, you're eating this cake, and saying, who would eat a half-stale cake? You know, she tells her, that's a really, I can't remember the exact term, something like, that's not a classy thing to do, even for a 7-year-old. Who would do something like that?
Implying she's a lower class person.
She's a lower class person,
right.
That she's a loser, that she is, that there's something wrong with her, and mocking her. And so on top of that sadness, she now feels a combination of shame, embarrassment, and guilt, and yet she still wants the cake. Because the cake and the sweetness of that cake is there at that moment to relieve those feelings. If only I can get that taste, these feelings will go away.
Right.
That's the link that is formed.
Right.
That's the initial sensitizing event in this instance. There's the link.
And think about the power of what you just said is now she's linked the having that sweetness and achieving that to things like I must not be good enough
Right.
that someone won't buy me a cake.
Right.
I mean that's your whole self-worth.
Absolutely.
That's being tied to getting that sweetness.
Right.
So if you don't get it, your self-worth is you're just not worth anything.
Right.
And her friend was very clear the way she put her down, saying she's not, basically telling her she's not worth anything.
Right.
Yeah.
And so again, so that you folks understand that and how we work, and since this is about hypnosis, let's understand how this is working hypnotically. You've probably heard us say many times that hypnosis is the bypass of the critical faculty of the subconscious mind to the admission of acceptable selective thinking. So the bypass of the critical faculty happens when she's in this very emotionally charged state. And the bypass is happening right there. And the selective thinking is sweetness equals relief from this feeling.
Right.
That becomes the governing idea. At that moment, it goes right in. It bypasses that critical faculty. She's young, right into the mind. And it's accepted as a truth. That becomes the truth of the mind.
Right.
But that's only the beginning of the story. It's not the end of the story. It's not even the middle of the story.
Right.
Because what has to happen is that has to be compounded. By compounded, we mean that now, each time she experiences those similar feelings, sadness, lack of self-worth, guilt, shame, she feels she has to get relief of them. And how do you get relief? Well, the subconscious mind said, well, it's obvious. You got relief of those by having that sweet taste. So do it again. And if you experience more of those, have more of that, right? And this becomes the compounding, not at a conscious level, but at a subconscious level. And this, folks, is the hypnosis that's causing her to follow behaviors that she does not want.
Right.
Right?
And if you think about it, as you gain severe amounts of weight, well, you're not going to feel so good about yourself. Well, that brings you back to, okay, then it's linked to feel good. I need the sweets.
Right.
Which it's a vicious cycle.
Right.
That reinforces itself that way.
And so this becomes the initial sensitizing event. But she doesn't start gaining weight at this point. She starts gaining weight at the triggering event. And the triggering event is her moving. Why? It stimulates very, very strong feelings of that sadness, that loss, and all the other feelings that followed it. And then it becomes most fully linked to food because the relief of those feelings is seen through food and through sweetness, and that's when it begins. Now it really begins compounding. So we're looking at two different events. The earlier initial sensitizing event, the subsequent sensitizing event acting as a trigger.
Right, right.
And so it was necessary, firstly, to begin the process of change for this lady, for her to release the feelings and the emotions trapped in her, connected with that initial event. The insight changes, and then we move her forward in time hypnotically, and she changes that. And now, the underlying connection between sweetness and the relief of certain emotions is gone. Sweetness just becomes sweetness. And she did a remarkable thing in the hypnosis, because if you ever join us or follow us for these practices, we don't just take you through an incident once, we take you through a number of times because we want to see how your feelings and emotions change.
Right.
And then after I'd taken her through this initial incident with tasting the cake 2 or 3 times, she said a very funny thing. She tasted it and she said, this doesn't even taste good. It tastes stale. Yeah. Right? It doesn't. It's not even really very good. Right. She's literally reliving those tastes. This isn't a memory. This is beyond that. She's experiencing them once again because the subconscious mind has the capability of doing that because of its enormous power and its capacity to bring you there on the feelings.
Right.
So having done that and cleared those emotions and gone back through it, here's what happens. Feelings and emotions become just feelings and emotions. When I say just, I don't mean to minimise their importance. I mean they're treated separately. They're not linked to that thing.
Right.
And cake or any sweetness just becomes cake or sweetness, right?
Right.
That you taste and decide you want or not want, but it's not linked to the relief or the desire to relieve yourself from certain feelings.
So there's two things there that are really important. Number one is that you took her back to this initial event, and that's the seed. It didn't trigger it. The trigger was a couple of years later, a year or two later. Right. But you've got to relieve those. You've got to release those emotions. So first, you brought her back, and you helped her release those trapped emotions, right. Sadness, and all that stuff that's there. Right. So first of all, you're draining it out of there. Right. And secondly, you're breaking the link.
Right.
And so between the two of them, so you have nothing underneath left driving it. Right. They still remember the event, and still it's not a good event when someone's telling you, these things. But the fact is that it's not linked to the emotions. The emotions are released and are gone, and so it's not being driven. And
as an adult, because she is not just that child now, she is the adult, she finds herself able to forgive that other 7-year-old insensitive little girl, because she's an insensitive 7-year-old, but just a 7-year-old. She recognises that unless she allows it to, those words don't really have any power over her, but they did then when she was a young person.
Right.
So she finds the capacity to forgive her, forgive herself, find some benefit in that, where there is a benefit, and she found a benefit in it, believe it or not, and move on from that scene. And again, this isn't by detaching the emotions or hating the other person
or
hating herself or desensitizing. It's a change in perception of what that event really means and what to her and how it affected her life. From that moment onwards, there's insight develops. Insight plus emotional release. Insight in and of itself, we say, is not enough. Emotional release in and of itself, while it can be very helpful, is not enough. But the combination of insight and emotional release can produce permanent and lasting change, because it realigns the conscious and subconscious mind. The conscious mind providing the understanding, the subconscious mind the release, and they begin to work together to produce the changes that people want.
Right, and it's a really odd thing, but it's just, I've seen it in my own, that I've done hypnosis for myself, is that without those strong emotions, they're trapped there and linked to that event. The event just becomes words on a page almost. Right. Because it doesn't have any power without the emotion.
Correct.
And even things as traumatic as child abuse and things like that.
Yes.
Once you release the emotion that gets trapped there, the person isn't traumatized anymore.
And they're not driven by it, and it's not
right.
dominating their lives. And folks, again, to really emphasize this, we're not saying that we pretend these events don't happen or they don't
right.
have significance, not at all. It's just the person has an opportunity to, in a sense, reparent themselves, in a sense, behave in a different way, have a different choice as how
right.
they perceive that event. And when they do that, they literally change in the past.
Right.
Because the past isn't just the objective event, it's the perception of the event.
Right.
And so when they change their past subconsciously, their future must change.
Right.
Everything forward of that. And so, having got to that point, we then went forward to the event where she moved from one place to mm-hmm. another, and the feelings and the perceptions were changed.
Right.
Now, at that point, what do we have? We have a lady there whose whole connection and attitude towards food, particularly sweet foods, has changed.
Right.
But for her to lose weight, that's not enough.
Right.
And this comes to the second part of what we do. Because the second part of what we do is she's been following a series of practices connected with food since she was a little girl.
Right.
And they include, for example, constantly having to have chocolate or other sweet things at certain times. And we might properly call these habits. So we're now dealing with the habit aspect of how she eats.
Right.
And in connection with that, what we do is we give her a set of rules to follow hypnotically.
Right.
Which are not linked, but are actually part of the natural way we would contend that we are supposed to be with food.
Right.
And we can talk about those.
So we're going to talk about the golden rules, as we call them. But just one thing to emphasize is right. You're exactly right when you say okay, we've released that issue, but she's lived this way in this manner for all these years.
Right.
Okay, so most of the time you're going to be disconnected from your body. Your feelings of when you're satiated,
Right.
You've been ignoring for so many years
Right.
because you're just powering through and keeping eating.
Right.
You know, you might have used it to kill time, relieve boredom.
Right.
Even small
Absolutely.
emotional things and all
Yes.
this to fill emptiness as entertainment.
Yes.
So there's all these things that you've built in your life as habits and little things that now we need to help you fix.
Right.
Because even though you've gotten rid of the basic thing, you still have all these habits.
Right.
So that's when we're going to get to realigning those habits and giving them a sense of when they're hungry. Because a lot of times people, you eat along and if you listen to your body, it'll tell you when you're full.
Right.
But if you just eat quickly and keep going through it, you won't even notice it.
Right.
And you probably actually, even if you're not paying attention, you won't notice it.
Right.
So, so do you want to go through some of the?
Sure. So the first thing I want to say, folks, is that we're almost going to start at the end. Here's the big news: is you can lose weight without dieting. Our programs do not involve dieting, by which we mean all the things that Bill talked about earlier: calorie counting, programs, certain foods here, not certain foods there. Once those emotions connected with food are cleared out, if you're following certain rules, you're going to return steadily to a natural, healthy weight for reasons that we're going to explain in a second. Now,
Right.
let's be very clear about this. It doesn't mean that the weight that you find yourself is the weight that you want to be, and all of a sudden, there's going to be a change. But once those changes are made, and the other thing is on our programs, it's not as spectacular as some of the other programs. On our programs, you might be losing 2 pounds a week or something like that, not more than that. And so, but 2 pounds a week is a lot. That means in 25 weeks, if you keep that up, you can lose 50 pounds.
And one of the differences too is these other programs, you're forcing the weight down,
Right.
okay, artificially. Ours is just you realign the behaviors and the weight does it on its own.
That's right.
You're not having to force it.
Exactly. And that means also, from a physiological point of view, you're unlikely to stimulate a physiological change, by which I mean a slowing of metabolic rates and other things like that.
Right.
Because you're not sending the messages to the mind that Bill was talking about of scarcity.
Right.
It's not there. In fact, it's the opposite of what's going to happen. So we have 4 very simple rules, which we're going to tell you about now. And we're happy to reveal these rules because, number 1, they're natural. Number 2, even if you were to follow these rules in a conscious state, they would have, of course, an effect, but they're not going to have the sort of power that they have when we work with you hypnotically.
Right.
So it's the hypnosis, the bypass of the critical faculty, that makes the difference. So what are the natural rules of eating? They're very, very simple. And they apply to us when we're very small. We eat when we're hungry.
Right.
That's simple, isn't it?
Not by time.
Not by time.
Not by its
Not
noon,
because it's 1 o'clock and I must eat now, or
Right.
it's 6 o'clock and now's the time for dinner,
Right.
or it's breakfast time, so I must eat. Otherwise, we eat when we're hungry.
Right.
And here's the next shocking one, folks. We stop when we're full. We stop when we're satisfied.
Yep.
Right? We don't, and that means simple, rules of society are bypass. Oh, I have to eat dessert after dinner, or I must eat this amount because it's on my plate because I don't want to offend mother or
Right.
friend by showing that I lack love by not following and eating an amount on the plate. These have nothing to do with the natural system of eating.
Right.
Quite simply, and if any of you folks have had little children, my little children like this, right now, they'll get to a point where there might be a small amount of food left, and there's a little part of you that goes, can't you just finish that and then I don't have to clean the plate off? But they don't want to. They're satisfied. They're connected with that mechanism of satisfaction, satiety. And this mechanism, folks, is a real mechanism. It's not just an idea. It's a sense of feeling satisfied and full,
Right.
which, as Bill has said, we've often switched ourselves off to
Right.
through life. And folks, what's the big thing that switches it off as adults? Diets,
Right.
right? We're turning off that mechanism every time we're counting those points, measuring those calories, saying we can't eat that and must eat that. We're constantly trying to use our conscious mind to override the intelligence in our subconscious mind, which tells us we're done, right?
Right. Right.
So we got 2 rules.
Yep.
Here's a 3rd rule. Here's a shocker. We eat what we want, not what we think we should. And again, this is, when I say this to most people, they're horrified. They think that that means they're going to forever be eating candy bars or ding-dongs or I don't know, whatever those things are, or some sweet. They think that their whole life is going to be full of fast food and sweet things. But when the fourth rule comes in, they're going to find it's not the case. Because the fourth rule, which links all of these together, and so simple, is that you taste what you eat and drink. There's a shocker, folks. You taste what you eat and drink. What does that mean practically? It means that instead of shoveling food in whilst we're working on a computer or watching a screen or playing on a phone or doing some other activity, this mindless eating, we're actually tasting what we are eating and drinking, really tasting it.
Right.
The textures,
Right.
the saltiness, the sweetness, the sourness, every element of that food, and eating slowly enough to do it. One of the things sometimes I ask people to do is they'll take some food, put it in their mouth, put their utensils down, chew it, slow down the eating rather than shoveling it in, you know?
Right.
And by doing that, because we've installed these things in a hypnotic state and we've cleared the other feelings, emotions and sensations, they reconnect to their feelings of satisfaction.
Right. It actually does. It actually, eating slower actually does two things. Number one, you do taste every bite. You're going to feel more satisfied because you've noticed more.
Yes.
And secondly, you give your body time to give you the signal.
That's right.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
right. And so you wake yourself up to the signal.
Right.
And this leads us to something that that you might have heard about. There's something called the hypnotic gastric band.
Right.
Now, what does that mean? It means that that some hypnotists, and I've done it before, install the idea that somebody has had lap band or gastric band surgery. Now, let's talk about this a little bit. There's a lot of nonsense and hocus pocus talked about this, even in the hypnotic world. People know that they haven't had lap band surgery.
Right.
I mean, I've heard all sorts of nonsense talked about this, where some hypnosis practitioners claim that, you know, they bring people into like a medical facility and they dress in white coats and they have them wheeled in and the atmosphere smells of alcohol to make them believe that
They actually put this whole show on.
Yes, I mean this is absolute nonsense. I mean this is not. I mean it's fallacy.
Right.
They know that that's not happened. So what do we mean truly by a hypnotic gastric band? Here's what happens. Some people, because of all the things that we've been talking about together, are so disconnected from their feelings of satisfaction that they literally don't know when they're hungry and when they're full.
Right.
And so hypnotically what we do is we install a set of ideas that sharpens up that sensitivity. So we call it a gastric band. They're very, very aware of when they're full,
Right.
super aware. And once we've switched that on to a high degree, it re-stimulates that sense of satiety, and then they can follow these rules more easily. So it's a hyper form of what we were talking about.
Right.
But it's no more than that. Nobody
Right.
truly believes that, you know, they've actually had gastric band surgery.
Right.
They simply behave for a short period of time as if they had.
They're connected to. I mean, how many times do you hear people, you know, especially at say Thanksgiving or whatever, push away from the table and I'm so full, and
Right.
that's because you pushed so far beyond
Right.
the full state.
Right.
You know, that you've stretched everything out. So all we're doing is making them more aware of it.
That's right.
Right.
And so these are the two parts, the two essential parts to the program and the parts that make the program effective. You deal with the underlying cause and reason why there's been an increase in weight, and then you give people a new set of behaviours to follow,
Right.
so that it begins to change itself. And I think this was characterised most fully by a lady that called me up some time ago, and she said, you know, Neil, I wanted to tell you this. She called me up almost a year after I worked with her, and she said, I went to a doctor. She said, I've been overweight all my life since I was a little girl, and I heard something from a doctor that I'd never heard before in my life. He said to me, don't lose any more weight.
That's funny.
And she said,
Yeah.
but that's not why I'm calling you. I'm calling you because I don't feel like it's been too easy. I don't feel like I've really changed anything.
Right.
And that's exactly the way it's supposed to be,
Right.
right? Because we got to the root of those ideas, gave her a new set of behaviours which are based upon the intelligence of the body and the mind acting together, and not in a week or 2 weeks or 5 weeks, but in about 6 to 7 months. She was at a weight that she'd never been at in her whole life, and she felt so good about her life.
It's virtually effortless, and that's made possible by the deep hypnotic state,
Yes.
where we can clear the emotions, and where we also give these powerful suggestions, because you can give these consciously,
Right.
and people know these. That's why we could tell on TV, because
Right.
people know these rules,
Right.
right? But if they don't have them deep inside,
Right.
it's not the same thing.
And if there's not the clearance, and folks, and that also, and I want to emphasise another thing, there's a lot of hypnotic programs that are out there that involve you going to these big groups, you know, anywhere from 10 people to 50, 100 people, and everybody's in a hypnotic state. But you can't do the sort of regression work that we were talking about to get back to those initial sensitising events in a big group setting.
Right.
And that's why, you know, the work that we do is individual. Even though we talked about the outlines of a program, we're talking about things individually tailored to that person, because that
Right.
person's initial sensitising event and subsequent sensitising event is not going to be the same as their neighbours,
Right.
and their friends and their family.
Right.
So these are individually tailored programs.
Right.
following certain
Plus
principles.
the other things, a couple other things we tell them is, is that they need to drink enough water.
Yeah,
They need to get enough sleep.
absolutely
And
important.
they're
yeah.
finding that link more and more, that
Absolutely.
if you don't sleep enough, your diet's not right,
Right.
and you're going to gain weight. But the other thing that we do, it's a really comprehensive program that
Yes,
we
it
do,
is.
and it's customized. Is we teach them self-hypnosis and,
Yes.
and how to use it.
Yes.
So you walk away with powerful tools that you could use
Absolutely.
to reinforce these things and so forth. So it's a very comprehensive program.
Right,
And that's why it's successful.
right,
But if you don't have all those components,
right.
it's
And
temporary.
that's the key for it. And so what we're talking about, not just a simple diet, but re-establishing your whole relationship to food, which is where we started, 2 weeks ago. We started talking about the relationship to food because, folks, we all need to eat and drink. It's just a
Right.
question of when, what, how much, and what's driving those things.
Right.
So we hope that talking about these things has led you to a greater understanding of how we work, but more importantly, to what your choices are. If you or a colleague or a friend or a family member wants to lose weight and change their whole relationship to food in a positive and healthy way.
Right.
That's how what we do, we believe, helps.
Right. Right. And it is just easy
It's just
compared
easy.
to all the other methods.
It really is.
Yeah.
So thanks very much. We hope this was useful, and we look forward to speaking with you and meeting you again on a next edition of Hypnosis Helps, where we'll pick up another topic. And from myself, Neil Myers, thanks very much for watching, and from my colleague, Bill Miller, we appreciate your attention and presence. Goodbye.